In the vast, secluded woodland of northern Maine, where civilization bends before the silence of ancient trees, a religious refuge operated for more than 3 decades without almost anyone daring to question its existence. It was called the Shrine of Saint Abnegation, a carefully chosen name, imbued with sanctity and humility. Yet behind its thick walls and windows too high to peer through lurked one of the most disturbing episodes in forgotten American history. Some 600 women passed through those gates seeking spiritual solace, but fewer than half returned. And those who did return, returned mute, hollowed out, shadows of their former selves. For more than a century, state archives have kept the statements of a single survivor sealed. These accounts were so disturbing that authorities felt the public was simply not prepared to deal with what she had witnessed. Tonight, we will cross the walls of time and memory to reveal what really happened between the stone columns of that place that called itself the house of God but was more like a prison for the soul. Before we continue with this deep dive into the darkness, be warned. This video is not for everyone. It is for those with the stomach. For those with the courage. For those who seek more than comfortable truths. If you are among those who dare to touch what was buried, click subscribe now and comment on where in Brazil or the world you are watching from. But be warned, there is no turning back from what comes next. The most terrifying thing about this case is that the horrors committed there were not driven by fanatical religion, nor by dark or supernatural forces. What happened at the Shrine of Saint Abnegation was something much colder and more calculated. It was science. Pure science, devoid of ethics. Fueled by an insatiable desire for knowledge no matter the cost. And the cost was human. It was psychological. It was spiritual. The year was 1798. At the time, Maine was still just a territory attached to Massachusetts, a wild land surrounded by hostile mountains and forests so dense that they swallowed up any trace of civilization. In the small coastal village of Norhill, a community of less than 300 inhabitants made up of lumberjacks, fishermen, and a few wheat traders, 3 women arrived one gray October morning. They were the Marrow sisters. Their entrance was theatrical. The carriage, pulled by 2 black horses, carried heavy, covered boxes, from which wafted the smell of alcohol, herbs, and other medicinal compounds that no local peasant could identify. The eldest, known as Mother Celestine Marrow, stepped down from the carriage with an attitude that exuded authority. Her hair, black with silvery strands, was tied back under a modest veil, and her eyes, gray like the fog that covered the village, scanned the surroundings as if she already knew every corner of the place. Beside her appeared her middle sister, Sister Eugenia, tall, thin as a living skeleton, and whose movements had the almost supernatural precision of a surgeon. Last, almost hidden under the brown cloak, came the young novice, Lucia. A little over 20 years old, she looked like an angel molded from porcelain, with black hair, translucent skin, and eyes so dark they seemed like windows to a bottomless abyss. The 3 claimed to have come from England, fleeing religious persecution against Anglican orders of women. They claimed to have sought refuge in America to establish a new congregation, dedicated to the spiritual care of suffering women. They brought with them letters of recommendation, seals, and documents that impressed the few literate people in the village but that, decades later, would be revealed as forged with disturbing mastery. But no one questioned them. On the contrary, many felt honored by the presence of such learned women dedicated to their faith. The sisters' money seemed to have no end. With silver coins and rare banknotes, they bought a vast tract of land 15 miles from town that belonged to a debt-ridden widow. They paid 3 times the asking price, which aroused whispers, but also sealed the eternal gratitude of the local authorities. With the land in hand, the Marrows hired every mason and carpenter in the region to build their institution. Within 8 months, a structure that looked more like a fortress than a convent had risen in the heart of the forest. 3 stories of dark stone, tiny windows placed purposefully high, doors reinforced with iron locks, and a basement so deep that it required excavation beyond the norm. When asked about the style of construction, Mother Celestine simply smiled and replied, "True purification demands isolation. And salvation, absolute silence." The explanation was accepted. The Marrows oversaw every detail of the construction. They made unusual modifications such as drainage ducts capable of handling large volumes of liquid and ventilation systems that seemed more suited to a hospital than a house of worship. The local physician, Dr. Nathaniel Groves, an enthusiast of modern science, quickly became an ally. Enchanted by the sisters' sophisticated discourses on healing the female mind, he offered logistical support and even helped with the supply of sedatives, herbs, and equipment. The convent's reputation grew. Within a few years, families from all over Maine and even neighboring states began sending their troubled daughters, wives, and mothers to be reformed under the care of the Marrow Sisters. The cost was high. Short treatments cost the equivalent of a year's labor for a peasant. But the marketing was subtle and effective. Rumors of miraculous cures, of astonishing transformations, of once rebellious women who returned docile, obedient, ready for marriage and domestic life. But there was something strange. The women who returned came back very different. Some had memory lapses. Others seemed to have lost all trace of personality. Their eyes were blank. Their smiles, when they existed, were practiced. And all, without exception, had small scars on their scalps, almost always disguised by new hairstyles imposed by the convent's rule of humility. What was most disturbing, however, were those who never returned. Every year, dozens of women disappeared without a trace, with vague explanations given to their families. They chose total seclusion, they fled in the middle of the night, they were called by God to distant missions. The letters that families sent to the convent, asking for news or visits, rarely received a reply. And when they did receive them, they were written with generic phrases and official stamps that seemed to hide more than they revealed. However, everything began to fall apart on a cold February night in 1803. Thomas Alcott, a young hunter from the village of Norhill, was chasing a wounded deer when he accidentally approached the convent. Amidst the silence of the forest, something caught his attention. A sound, not from nature but human. Screams. Long, rhythmic, interspersed with pleas, moans, and something that sounded like the metallic creaking of instruments. Thomas, curious and frightened, approached. Through the basement window, partially covered in snow, he saw something he would never forget. A woman tied to a table, her head immobilized, part of her skull exposed. Above her, Sister Eugenia, handling a metal rod with surgical precision. Beside her, Mother Celestine took cold notes. And Lucia, the novice, passed instruments with the coldness of a military nurse. Thomas stepped back. Not only because of the horror of the scene but because he understood, clearly, that this was no exception. It was routine. And it was just the beginning. Thomas Alcott arrived in the village before dawn, his face pale and his eyes wild, as if he had glimpsed hell itself within the stone building. He stumbled along the frozen dirt road until he reached his father's smithy, which was still closed at that hour. He burst through the door, shouting, babbling incoherent words between his tears about open heads, sharp instruments, and prayers mixed with shouts. His father, a gruff, skeptical man who had never allowed a tear to be shed in front of his children, grabbed the boy by the shoulders and demanded that he calm down. But as Thomas recounted each detail, the sounds, the smells, the sights, the faces, the old blacksmith's expression darkened. He knew his son. He could tell the difference between delirium and traumatic memory. And what he saw in the boy's eyes that morning was no fantasy. It was the stark, brutal truth. Still, like any practical man of the time, he tried to rationalize. Maybe they did a medical operation. The sisters take care of the girls' minds, don't they? Maybe it's something necessary. But the more he heard, the harder it was to sustain that comfortable version. Thomas described the cellar in detail. The arrangement of the instruments, the way the bodies were restrained, the look on the mother's face as she wrote it all down coolly, as if she were a scientific experiment and not a woman screaming with her skull split open. He even described the smell, a mixture of alcohol, iron, and something else, something putrid like flesh burned under pressure. The next morning, old Alcott sought out Deacon Ezra Morrow, a man of standing in the village, known for his righteousness and influence. The deacon listened to the story with silent attention. His face showed neither horror nor disbelief, only growing unease. After a long pause he said, "Accusations like these can destroy the soul of a community. We are talking about women of God. Respected women. Charitable women. But if there is any truth to this, we must investigate it with the utmost discretion." And so, a week later, under the pretext of inviting the sisters to a church benefit, Deacon Morrow visited the shrine of Saint Abnegation. He was received by Mother Celestine herself in a Spartan reception room, where the tall windows cast long shadows and the central crucifix seemed to watch every movement. The mother was cordial, offered tea and inquired after the health of the deacon's wife with the elegance of an aristocratic lady. When he mentioned, with the care of a diplomat, that local hunters had heard unusual sounds coming from the convent during the night, Celestine did not bat an eyelid. "Penance sessions, Mr. Morrow, often require our inmates to confront the deepest sins of their souls. Not all are ready for purification. There is resistance. There is pain. And there is liberation. She smiled ruefully, as if she regretted the hardship of the path but believed in the beauty of destiny. She spoke of inner demons, moral vices, and how Christian discipline required firm measures. She mentioned deep prayer as a technique, seclusion as a path to redemption, and even cited biblical examples. Her speech was impeccable, cultured, convincing. But what disturbed the deacon was not the content, it was the tone. There was a rehearsed coldness there, as if she were reciting not a creed but a memorized formula. Before leaving, Morrow asked to visit the inmates. He was led through immaculately clean dormitories, where some women sat silently, staring at the floor. Others mumbled unintelligible prayers, as if they had been taught to repeat them without thinking. What struck him most, however, was the way they moved, their steps too restrained, too synchronized. It was like watching a play where the actors had been instructed to appear human, but were not. When the deacon asked to see the cellars, the nun gracefully retreated. These are the most delicate facilities. Deep spiritual treatment requires privacy. Some procedures would compromise the dignity of the inmates if observed by male eyes. It was an unassailable argument within the social conventions of the time. Morrow, though still uneasy, left the place with no evidence, no screams, no bodies, but with a chill that refused to leave him. The following week, something changed in the convent. The sounds that had previously echoed into the early hours of the morning ceased, not out of relief, but because they were replaced by an even more disturbing silence. A silence in which screaming seemed to have become unnecessary. Even so, the women continued to arrive, sent by desperate families seeking a cure for behaviors considered inappropriate. Girls who refused to marry, women who cried too much, wives who complained about their husbands, daughters who read poetry or questioned sermons. All it took was one deviation, one behavior outside the norm, and off they went for treatment. The ones who returned broken. Not in the figurative sense, but literally. Mary Donnell, a spirited young woman who charmed the village with her voice and sense of humor, was sent away after she had rejected 3 suitors, all wealthy and well-off. Rebellion, her father said. Demonic influence, her mother said. After 4 months at the convent, Mary returned silent. She looked at her parents as if they were strangers. She accepted her first marriage proposal with a faint smile and a voice that was barely audible. When asked about her time at the shrine, she would say only, "I prayed. A lot." Her skull, during a bath, revealed discrete marks, subtle lines of scars, as if someone had redrawn the surface of her mind. Cases like Mary's were multiplying. Women who had been full of life were now obedient dolls. They behaved perfectly, and they were praised for it. Parents said they had finally gotten their daughters back. Husbands said their wives now knew how to put themselves together. But a few, more attentive mothers, more sensitive brothers, saw that something had died there. Something essential. Something that would never return. Dr. Groves, the village physician, continued to endorse the treatments, even as his appearance began to deteriorate. His gaze grew vacant. His speech became increasingly incoherent. He talked about advances, about overcoming the backwardness of American medicine. His diaries, discovered decades later, would reveal dark notes. He knew. He had seen. He had helped. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of this story. These were not isolated monsters operating in the shadows. They were silent accomplices, respected professionals, entire families who, out of convenience or fear, chose silence. They chose to ignore their scars. They chose obedience over humanity. What else was the convent hiding? What came next did not come from police investigations or public denunciations. The truth began to emerge silently, hidden in the folds of a dress, between the seams of a young woman who refused to be erased. Her name was Sarah Whitman, and she was the only woman to leave the shrine of Saint Abnegation not only alive, but conscious. Conscious enough to write, to name the horror, and to keep evidence. Unlike most inmates, Sarah did not arrive at the convent as a soul already bent. She was not a woman ashamed of her freedom. She was the daughter of Boston merchants, raised amid books, discussions, salons, and private lessons that stimulated her mind from an early age. Her fault? Having become pregnant by a man who refused to take responsibility for the child. Her reaction? Refusing an abortion, refusing a forced marriage, refusing silence. For her family that was intolerable. And the solution was immediate: institutionalization. She arrived at the convent in the winter of 1819, at the age of 24. She was physically frail but mentally intact. Her first days were spent doing what the sisters called spiritual mapping. Invasive questions, sensory tests, detailed skull measurements, interviews conducted by Sister Eugenia with disturbing precision. Everything was documented on index cards. Everything was filed. Sarah quickly understood that this was not a house of prayer. It was a laboratory. She observed. She memorized. And, with the cunning of someone who knows she is surrounded by predators, she began to record every detail of what she saw. She wrote her notes on small pieces of cloth, dyed with blackberry juice, and hid them inside her clothes. She described the sisters' routines. The times when the other inmates were taken to the cellars. The muffled voices in the early hours of the morning. The silent returns, the empty stares, the marks that formed on scalps days later. Her intelligence caught the attention of Mother Celestine, who quickly realized that this inmate was different. Undisciplined. Too lucid. And for that very reason dangerous. In the following days, Sarah was subjected to what they called preparation. Sleep deprivation, abrupt changes in diet, complete isolation for days. The techniques, now recognizable as forms of psychological torture, were called intensive spiritual retreats. Extreme temperatures, repetitive sounds, whispered insults day and night by Sister Lucia, who smiled as she listed the young woman's sins. All with the aim of breaking her resistance before the deep treatment. But Sarah resisted. And the more she resisted, the more she learned. She observed how the sounds of the basement's drainage gates coincided with nights of intensive prayer. How the smell of ether leaked down the stairs in the following days. How some women were carried out and others were never seen again. And then came the storm. On the night of March 11, 1819, a flash flood caused by constant rain forced the sisters to evacuate part of the basement. Equipment, boxes, and records were rushed downstairs, and amid the chaos, Sarah saw her opportunity. Taking advantage of a moment of distraction, she escaped from the cell where she was being held and descended the auxiliary stairs that led to the lowest level of the convent, the place where no one would ever willingly let her enter. What she saw there, she would later record as the epicenter of human oblivion. Containment beds. Surgical tools that had never existed in official medicine at the time. Glass jars with fragments of brain tissue, carefully labeled with names, dates, and observations. An extensive file with entries ordered by procedure number. Notes written in clear, organized handwriting, Sister Eugenia's, detailed the desired behavior changes and the results obtained. One particular passage described the case of a 19-year-old woman whose excessive reading was diagnosed as a gender disorder. The procedure involved selectively destroying regions associated with language and memory. Sarah, already shaking with horror, realized that this was not a convent. It was an experimental center. A laboratory hidden behind crosses and prayers. She stole as many documents as she could hide on her body. Fragments of papers, copies of letters, notes. She went upstairs silently, returned to her cell, and waited for the next morning. The escape happened 2 nights later. On a moonless night, Sarah attacked one of the convent's guards, a man hired by the order under the pretext of spiritual protection, and ran into the forest. She spent 3 days hiding among the trees, surviving on hidden scraps of food, rainwater, and her instincts. The sisters, realizing the risk Sarah represented, began a relentless search, using local patrols and even offering rewards for information. They announced that a mentally unstable woman had escaped from the convent, putting her own safety and that of others at risk. But Sarah continued, bleeding, feverish, driven only by one fixed idea, to reach the village and tell what she knew. On the 3rd day she met a hunter, Joshua Meadows, who was startled to see her emerge from the woods, covered in bruises, with feverish eyes and carrying fragments of stained paper tied with strips of cloth. But when he heard what she said, the names, the instruments, the dates, he understood that this woman was telling the truth, and that she needed to be heard. He took her to the Norhill Sheriff's office. Sarah arrived physically shattered but mentally lucid. She told her entire story. She handed over the evidence. And she defied the silence of a village that for years had accepted the sanctity of the convent without ever asking questions. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the authorities organized an expedition to the convent. 15 armed men accompanied by doctors and a local judge. But when they arrived, the sanctuary was empty. The sisters had disappeared. Equipment gone. Bodies removed. Documents destroyed. Everything cleaned with surgical precision. Almost everything. In the cellars they found enough to confirm Sarah's every word. Instruments, vials, files, partially preserved corpses. Women scarred by incisions in their skulls, many still with restraints on their arms and legs. The bodies were catalogued. The structure was sealed. But the Marrow sisters would never be seen again. They had fled, rich, prepared, and invisible. In the next part we will reveal who these women really were, which European institutions had expelled the real doctors hidden behind veils and sacred names, and how, as unbelievable as it may seem, their secret research would shape modern psychiatry for decades to come. If you've made it this far, comment, "I don't close my eyes." The search for the Marrow Sisters, or rather for the women who used that name, would become one of the most extensive and frustrating investigations in the criminal history of 19th century America. The mystery of their disappearance only deepened, but what finally emerged as the evidence left behind was analyzed, was even more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Because these three women were not just nuns. They were not just fugitives. They were doctors. And they had been on the run for far longer than anyone in Norhill could have imagined. Mother Celestine, Sister Eugenia, and novice Lucy Marrow were, in fact, Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashcroft, and Temperance Ashcroft, names that appeared in old files at the University of Edinburgh, the Glasgow Hospital, and even the Royal Society of London. Three academic figures who, in their time, had emerged as prodigies of female medicine in Europe, and who, mysteriously, disappeared from official records between 1795 and 1797. But her departures were not discreet. Agatha, then known as Dr. Brennan, had been accused of performing invasive procedures on non-consenting patients in an attempt to treat female hysteria. Her methods included electric shocks, trepanations, repeated bloodletting, and dietary restriction. Her supporters called her a pioneer. Her critics said she was a certified sadist. After the deaths of 3 patients at a private psychiatric hospital in Aberdeen, she was formally banned from practicing medicine in the UK. Her colleague and sister-in-law, Prudence Ashcroft, had worked with her for years, studying the effects of head trauma on behavior. Her experiments in Scottish asylums involved mapping pain and obedience, and included the use of heated irons, sensory deprivation, and deliberate trepanations to study the submission center in the human brain. She was denounced by an assistant and, to avoid trial, fled with her younger sister, Temperance, then just 19, before the courts could issue an arrest warrant. For 2 years the three disappeared. Then they reappeared in the United States as consecrated sisters, with forged religious documents and letters of recommendation signed by dead bishops. Now, with their identities revealed thanks to the files found in the convent, authorities began to trace their financial movements. They discovered bank accounts opened under false names in New York, Montreal, Lisbon, and Hamburg. They found records of purchases of medical equipment under forged identities. Everything indicated that the escape had been meticulously planned. It wasn't panic. It was logistics. Even more disturbing was what came to light next: the correspondence. Among the documents Sarah managed to recover were dozens of letters sent and received from doctors and universities in Europe. Encrypted correspondence with institutions in France, Germany, Scotland, and Austria, discussing surgical techniques, hypotheses about impulse control, and reports of clinical advances based on real-time observations. One name stood out in particular: Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. In the letters he thanked her for detailed records on the behavioral modulation of unstable women, and asked, in a particularly ominous letter, for more precise descriptions of the effects of partial removal of the hippocampus in volunteers resistant to religious indoctrination. Volunteers. The word that tried to soften what was, in fact, non-consensual human experimentation. These letters made it clear that the convent not only performed its experiments but commercialized them. There was a shadow market in medical information, a hidden circuit of dirty research, in which the Marrow Sisters, or Brennan and Ashcroft, served as primary suppliers. The buyers? Institutions that could never conduct human experiments in their own countries but would pay handsomely for realistic data. In one of the letters, dated 1814, Dr. Zimmermann writes, "Your latest reports are fascinating. Patient 244 with obsessive literary traits seems to have responded perfectly to the parieto-temporal intervention. The total disappearance of her interest in writing and reading, combined with her postoperative docility, suggests a direct connection between the treated region and the center of creative initiative." He was not referring to a person. He was referring to a result. Other correspondents spoke of compression of romantic desires, reduction of social anxiety by extracting tissue from the frontal cortex, and even elimination of critical and questioning tendencies by small incisions in the orbitofrontal area. This was not science. It was mutilation disguised as progress. With these revelations it became clear: the convent had been, for more than 20 years, one of the most sophisticated laboratories of clandestine neurological manipulation in the Western world. Its techniques preceded the first official studies on lobotomy by decades. Its impact, though not officially recognized for centuries, would influence generations of physicians. But the cost was unthinkable. The list of patients found in the archives contains 612 names. Of these, approximately 250 had been reformed and returned to their families. The others were classified into two categories: permanent residents, women who, according to the records, had chosen to remain in total seclusion after being cured, and unrecovered, a grim euphemism for dead. Many of the latter were found in the basements preserved in chemical liquids, stacked in drawers like laboratory specimens. The expected public outrage never came. The families, faced with the possibility that their wives, daughters, or sisters had been mutilated in the name of science, preferred silence. The scandal threatened their reputations, their social standing, their decency. Many remained silent. Others denied the facts. And the government, lacking popular support and afraid of exposing the involvement of influential doctors, quietly shelved the case. The building was burned down by the residents months later. A symbolic act, a desperate attempt to erase the stain of the past. But the documents, thousands of pages, had already been microfilmed by silent scholars. They were distributed to universities in the United States and Europe under the generic name Ashcroft dossier. Science, as always, took advantage of the horror and moved on. Sarah Whitman survived the convent of St. Abnegation. But no one survives what she endured unscathed. Her body escaped, but her mind remained captive to those stone walls for the rest of her life. She was the only voice that spoke out against the horror, and she paid a price as high as it was invisible: ostracism, humiliation, erasure. After testifying to the authorities and collaborating with the investigation, Sarah remained under surveillance for weeks. She received anonymous letters, whispered messages at the market, contemptuous glances from families whose daughters had come back better, thanks to the Marrow sisters. Many saw her not as a heroine, but as a traitor, someone who had tarnished the name of a respected order and brought public shame. Her own family, wealthy and influential in Boston, refused to take her back. Her parents claimed emotional incompatibility and cut her out of their will. Childhood friends would not answer her letters. And little by little, Sarah understood. No one wanted to know the truth. The truth was too ugly, too uncomfortable, too shameful. It was easier to pretend that nothing had happened, that the reformed girls had returned by a miracle, that the screams in the forest were just the wind. Sarah moved west in 1820 under an assumed name. She now called herself Margaret Ellis, and lived as a recluse for decades in a modest village in California, working as a teacher of orphan girls. There she rebuilt a routine. She never married. She never had children. And she rarely spoke of the past. But every night before going to sleep she wrote. Her writings were collected in a hand-bound diary hidden inside an old sewing box. In it she recounted everything, from the initial tests in the convent to the details of her escape. She documented with surgical precision the words of the sisters, the gestures of the inmates, the medical procedures, the transformations she witnessed. She described the changes in the personalities of the other women with the clinical eye of someone who understood the psychological mechanisms behind manipulation. But there were also pages of pain, of anger, of guilt. Guilt for not having been able to save anyone else. Guilt for having left others behind. Her diary was only found after her death in 1863 by one of her students, who was already an adult. The woman, who was involved in the women's suffrage and psychiatric reform movements at the time, gave the material to a professor at the newly founded University of California. At first he doubted the veracity of the narrative, but when he cross-referenced dates, names and locations with the Maine state archives, which had been partially declassified after the Civil War, he realized that Sarah was telling the truth. It was this diary that, decades later, allowed historians to accurately reconstruct what really happened at the Convent of Eternal Tears, a name that officially replaced the previous title after the horrors committed there came to light in academic circles. But the story does not end with Sarah. In the following decades, several sightings were recorded. 3 elderly women, always together, always discreet, were seen in places as diverse as Havana, Lisbon, Marseille, and Buenos Aires. In 1847, an English traveler reported meeting 3 distinguished ladies at a private clinic in Argentina. They claimed to treat female nerves with natural methods, but they described techniques that were eerily similar to those in the Ashcroft's notes. In 1856, a French doctor claimed to have encountered a Dr. Brennan in Paris. a gray-eyed woman with a British accent who treated upper-class ladies with mild brain stimulation and behavioral interventions. By the time authorities went to investigate, she had already disappeared. The most widely accepted hypothesis among modern investigators is that the three women split up after their escape. Each assumed a new identity. Agatha settled in Europe, selling knowledge. Prudence in the American South, operating remote clinics. And Temperance, well, Temperance may have died young. Or perhaps she continued to operate silently, operating as a ghost in some unknown basement. But the most terrifying thing of all may not be the whereabouts of the criminals. It's what happened to their legacy. Because even without public recognition, even without credit, even as wanted criminals, their ideas were absorbed. In the following years, universities such as Harvard, Yale, and Edinburgh incorporated psychiatric techniques based on anonymous reports and field cases that, when analyzed, showed striking similarities with the sisters' procedures. The idea of behavioral modulation by brain stimulation, the hypothesis that memories could be erased by physical trauma, the concept that emotions could be reconfigured by conditioning, all of this, decades later, would be presented as scientific innovation, without ever mentioning its true origins. What the Ashcroft sisters did was monstrous, but it was also effective. And that is what is most frightening, because it shows how thin the line is between science and sadism, between healing and control, between salvation and submission. Sarah Whitman tried to warn the world. She wrote, spoke, exposed herself, and she was forgotten. The convent turned to ashes. Families fell silent. Universities benefited. And history became a footnote. But it doesn't have to be that way. Silence is a weapon, but it is also a choice. And in the case of the Convent of Eternal Tears, it was silence, more than scalpels or forceps, that ensured that the horrors perpetrated there remained hidden for so long. The silence of the families, the silence of the authorities, the silence of the doctors. Everyone collaborated, some out of fear, others out of convenience, and many out of direct interest. At the end of the official investigation, when the cellars were opened, the bodies counted and the documents reviewed, the question that hung in the air was not, how was this done? But how was this allowed? The answer lies not only in the actions of the Ashcroft sisters. It lies in the web of complicity that formed around them. A network of omission, denial, and active collaboration that sustained, for more than 2 decades, a clandestine center for human experimentation. Let's start with the doctors. Dr. Nathaniel Groves, who served as a regional physician, not only publicly endorsed the convent's methods, he nurtured them. He provided sedatives, referred difficult patients, received reports in exchange for favors, and even used the results as the basis for medical articles that he signed as his own discoveries. Groves, like other physicians of his generation, saw the Ashcrofts as a source of unprecedented knowledge, something that would put them ahead of their peers in the medical academies. His logic was perverse. These women have already been discarded by society. If they cannot be saved, at least they can serve science. But Groves was not alone. The files found include the names of at least 7 other physicians, from Maine, Massachusetts, and New York, who sent patients to the convent. Some under the guise of intensive spiritual treatment, others openly aware of what was going on there. All benefited from clinical feedback, notes, and in some cases, payment in kind. The second pillar of silence, families. Here the silence was more subtle, more intimate, more devastating. Imagine an influential father in Boston. His daughter begins to question her arranged marriage. She writes poems. She reads Mary Wollstonecraft. She talks about equality. He is ashamed. She becomes a problem. And then a solution appears, the convent. She goes. Months later she returns, submissive, silent, with no memory of her previous life. The father thanks God. Society applauds. And no one, absolutely no one, asks what happened in the meantime. This is the tragedy. Because when the truth came out, these families didn't want justice. They wanted secrecy. The idea that they had sent their daughters to an institution where parts of their brains were destroyed was unbearable. Exposing the crimes would be admitting their own mistake. So they preferred silence. Some paid to hush up the scandal. Others wrote sworn statements denying any wrongdoing. Many simply disappeared from the public sphere, as if their surnames could be dragged into oblivion along with their guilt. The third pillar, the state. The Maine District Attorney's Office opened an investigation. That's true. It sent agents. That's also a fact. But as soon as the ties to European universities, private hospitals, and influential figures were discovered, the brakes began to be applied. The government feared that opening up the case too much would expose the involvement of prestigious institutions. It was the kind of scandal that could erode public faith not only in churches but also in science, in politics, in American morality itself. And what does a government do when faced with something like this? It files it away. It files it away in boxes labeled with words like classified, federal property, inconclusive. It files it away and locks it away in cold rooms that no one enters for decades. It files it away until the dust becomes part of the paper. Until the past no longer has a voice. That's what they did with the Convent case. They sealed the evidence. They silenced the witnesses. And they rewrote the public record. 3 women fled after operating on a rogue medical facility. That was the official version. No mention of lobotomies. No mention of preserved corpses. No mention of black market research. And so, silence won. At least for a while. Because even when buried, truths don't disappear. They ferment. They wait. And sometimes, someone like Sarah Whitman comes along to dig them up. But even she was erased from the books. She never received redress. His name does not appear on monuments or in medical schools. His story only exists because it survived in diaries, letters and accounts by third parties. Now think about what that means. How many other Saras existed but never escaped? How many other convents were built under the guise of piety and charity but operated as factories of obedience, mutilation and silence? This story forces us to look at what lies beneath the rituals of respectability. It reminds us that institutions can be showcases for crime. And it warns us that often the greatest violence is not the act itself, but the collective decision to ignore it. The sisters, false identities, suspicious clinics abroad, and contemporary accounts that suggest their legacy may not have ended with the burning of the convent. Is it possible that their ideas, or even their disciples, still operate in the shadows? If you've made it this far, comment, "I hear what has been silenced." The ashes of the convent were blown away by the wind. The stone walls were reduced to ruins. The women who had screamed there now rested, voiceless, in anonymous graves or forgotten jars. But the story is not over. Because there are legacies that refuse to die. And there are ghosts that do not rest while their knowledge still walks among the living. The Ashcroft sisters, Agatha, Prudence and Temperance, did disappear, yes. But the traces they left behind continue to appear in the most unexpected places. Signs, clues, rumors, shadows of a presence that was never truly exorcised from history. In 1847, in the interior of Argentina, an English diplomatic report reported the presence of 3 elderly women operating a retirement home for ladies on the outskirts of Mendoza. The descriptions match: an older woman with gray hair and silver eyes, a slender, quiet woman with angular features and long hands, and a young woman who looked strangely frozen in time. They claimed to offer treatment for female emotional and intellectual disorders, and refused outside visitors. When an official inspection was requested, they were gone. Nothing remained but glass bottles of sedatives, rudimentary surgical instruments, and anatomy books written in Old English. Other reports emerged from Marseille in 1852, where a Dr. Brennan was said to have been seen discreetly treating elite women suffering from emotional delirium. A French physician, Dr. Marcel Duval, claimed in a letter that he had witnessed cranial stimulation techniques using metal inserts that he described as very similar to those described in the Ashcroft archives. The woman disappeared before any questioning could be conducted. But the most compelling report came from Paris in 1856. A renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Émile Cazeneuve, reported meeting a woman with an icy gaze, a firm voice and an aristocratic manner, who offered her advice in exchange for access to wealthy female patients who were dissatisfied with their matrimonial functions. Her name? Dr. Agnes Bronner, an altered version of Agatha Brennan. He said her methods involved hypnosis, specific diets, and what she called localized emotional brain alignment. But before any investigation could be started, she disappeared. Again. At this point, the most widely accepted hypothesis among scholars of the case is that the Ashcroft sisters had, in fact, planned their lives on the run years in advance. The bank records found indicated accounts opened in 5 countries, with careful withdrawals and transfers in local currencies. They had amassed a small fortune by selling knowledge, surgical information and even preserved bodies. And most disturbingly, they had created disciples. In the archives found beneath the convent, there were letters addressed to trusted ladies, in places such as New Orleans, Havana and Edinburgh. Training, instructions, formulas, protocols. Everything to replicate the Ashcroft method away from the eyes of the world. It is possible that the escape of the three was just the beginning of a much larger network, a kind of order of silence, where other women renegade scientists had been prepared to continue the work in decentralized cells. And so the question arises, has it stopped? In 1902, Broadmoor Hospital in England reported a series of female patients who, after corrective neurological treatments, began to exhibit symptoms identical to those described in the convent's records. Emotional absence, selective memory loss, automatic obedience, lack of initiative. Techniques described as psychosurgery field experiments. In 1928, a clinic in Vienna reported receiving vials of brain tissue and ensign diagrams, but with annotations written in the same style as the Ashcroft records. The images showed surgical insertion trajectories with millimeter precision. To this day, no one knows who sent them, and no one wants to know. Which brings us to a crucial point. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a mirror. A reminder that when knowledge is sought unethically, and science strays from compassion, the result is inhumane. Worse, the result is invisible. Silent. Applauded in clean rooms while executed in damp basements. Because the society that benefited from the Ashcroft's research also refused to question it. Modern medicine absorbed their ideas as if they were the legitimate fruits of fertile soil. It ignored the blood that soaked its roots. And to this day, techniques derived from their experiments, such as the modulation of behavior by neural stimuli, the application of compounds to erase memories, and the concepts of behavioral submission, still influence fields such as neuroscience, forensic psychiatry, and trauma psychology. But none of these sciences bear their name. No textbook mentions the convent. No college admits that part of its foundation was born of horror. And that is why this story needs to be told. Retold. Kept alive. Because the Ashcroft Sisters' greatest crime was not just what they did with scalpels and forceps. It was what they taught. What they left behind. What they hid behind other names, other practices, other banners. And society's biggest mistake was not allowing them to escape. It was allowing your ideas to continue moving forward, disguised as innovation. This is the end of the dossier. But perhaps it is only the beginning of your reflection. Now the question is, what do you do with this truth? Do you forget? Or do you share? If you got this far, comment, "The truth does not burn with the convent." Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to know this story. And prepare yourself for the next dark chapter in human history. See you in the next video, where we will reveal the secret hospital in the interior of Germany that trained Nazi doctors using living corpses even before World War II began. The shadows of history still hold many horrors. And we will illuminate them together.